I'm Lauren Summers. I'm Senior Director of Lifelong Learning and Travel at the Yale Alumni Association. This presentation is brought to you by Yale Alumni Academy, which is dedicated to bringing the faculty, research, scholarship, expertise of Yale to all of you around the globe for engagement experiences like our conversation with David Myers today. We got to know David Myers because he very kindly volunteered to lead a Yale trip to Madagascar that we had hoped would take place in 2020, had to be postponed in 2021, and now has been postponed again, unfortunately. So we didn't want to wait any longer to give people an opportunity to meet and hear from David. And so he was gracious enough to be willing to come to us today and give us this presentation. David is a 99 MBA from the School of Management at Yale and an environmental finance expert and entrepreneur with more than 25 years of experience in sustainability, business strategy and management, environmental economics, international conservation and development. He also has expertise in environmental impact assessment, training, and education, and he's done research in ecology and evolution. He's currently the executive director of the Conservation Finance Alliance. From 2012 to 2018, he was the senior technical advisor for the Biofin UNDP project. He has launched and managed various companies, including a financial services company providing online marketplaces for impact investing and environmental assets, a triple bottom line bamboo flooring manufacturer in Madagascar, and a technology incubator. He has spent well over a decade in Madagascar and has worked in 47 countries in addition to that. In Madagascar, he helped the country plan and execute a doubling of the area under conservation, including establishing the Makira Natural Park, which is a 370,000 hectare protected area. He holds a doctorate in biological anthropology and anatomy from Duke University and an MBA from the Yale School of Management, as I mentioned earlier. He spent much of his time in the 1980s and 1990s conducting research on lemurs in Madagascar, as well as working for nature conservation. He's the co-author of the first 2 editions of the Field Guide to Lemurs, and he's also fluent in French and speaks Malagasy. So imagine that we couldn't find a more perfect person to lead us on a group trip to Madagascar, someone who has both a business background in the country, as well as a conservation background and knowledge of lemurs. It's just remarkable, the experience that you have. David, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I will turn it over to you for our presentation.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I appreciate everyone coming out and hearing about this topic, which is, I'm going to share my screen here. So it's going to be finance for nature is the topic for tonight and or this afternoon, or depending on where you are. I'm going to give a sort of broad overview of the topic and where the field is right now, its importance, and I'm going to dive into some examples. I'll be talking for a bit, hopefully, at a level that's interesting to the wide range of interests and backgrounds that you all are bringing here. But there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussion after the presentation. So let me start off with asking the question, finance for nature. Why? Why do we need to finance nature? Well, nature provides a lot of amazing services and products that we rely on. Water systems, food, a lot of food diversity, soil health, pollinators, of course, are essential, provides coastal protection. These are what are called ecosystem services that we benefit from as humans. Of course, climate regulation, quite a big one, microclimates and generating local rainfall, as well as, of course, maintaining the global climate, which is obviously a large concern for everyone right now, but also, other services like recreation. We all like to get out and enjoy nature. It brings us incredible psychological benefit and value, and also health. I think somewhere around a quarter of all medicines come practically directly from natural products, and a lot of other knowledge we gain comes from nature as well. So nature provides all these amazing services to us. We absolutely rely on it. So why finance nature? Well, we need it. We absolutely need it. But why worry about it? In other words, why isn't nature covered by the marketplace? Because we don't necessarily have to finance McDonald's, although McDonald's does get some funding from banks, for example. But why a special area that's focused on financing nature? Generally, nature is not covered very well by the markets. In general, the ecosystem services and products that nature produces are public goods. They're hard to exclude. They're not necessarily attributed to individual ownership very easily, like the air we breathe, the water we drink. There's another point is that generally they're not included in the financial statements of businesses. So they tend, for example, if a company pollutes, sure, they could be responsible under certain regulations, but for the most part, that pollution goes into a stream, is carried down to other people that are going to experience poor health or an environment that is degraded as a result of it, and that's not part of the profit and loss statement of the company. That's called an externality. In that case, it would be a negative externality. But then there are positive externalities too, that nature provides all these great goods and services. As I mentioned before, a lot of the services are not included. We just take them for granted. Some other reasons that nature is hard to finance is its complexity. There's been a lot of interest in climate finance these days, and there's a very simple number that we can use. It's tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, CO2 equivalents, and you can get paid for mitigating them or trying to reduce them, offset them. And whereas nature, what number do we use? So, in some cases it could be area, but not each area is this. Each area is not the same, and so it's quite complex. It's also the ecological cycles of nature are quite long-term. Impacts are long-term. We don't necessarily feel them right away. So it's just tough to include nature in all its complexity in market mechanisms. So what do? We develop finance mechanisms, and we use the tools of finance to try to better include nature into markets, but also we try to understand how we can finance nature through a range of mechanisms. So the sort of one underlying trick here is converting the economic value of nature into different finance streams, and that's done through revenue where possible. We also can use these finance mechanisms to provide long-term financing, because keeping nature around is a long-term activity. It's not something that you can, do once and say, okay, we took care of that. That's covered. You actually have to continue making sure that nature is maintained and financed. And then finally, we use these mechanisms to align the interests of all the different players that interact with nature. So I'm going to get into so much detail here. We're going to dive into that in all great detail. But first, let's have a quick look at I'm sorry, I'm trying to move something so it's out of my way here. The existing finance for nature. So this is an estimate of the annual finance for nature. It comes from the year 2019. A group of a whole range of actors came together to come up with these numbers. And you can see the largest source of finance for nature comes from domestic budgets and tax policy. So, and this is in billion US dollars. So 76.5 billion US dollars a year comes from domestic budgets, financing for natural infrastructure, protecting coastlines, things like that, covers about 27 billion. A thing called biodiversity offsets, which is related to the infrastructure, development of infrastructure. When they impact nature, there's some requirements for them to offset that or compensate for that damage through investing in other areas and restoring biodiversity. Quite a big market in the U.S. As well as Australia. Official development assistance. This is money that comes from bilateral and multilateral donors, like USAID, for example, and the different governments around the world. For biodiversity and nature, Germany is one of the largest sources of financing for that. Sustainable supply chains. This is where companies actually investing in their supply chains to try to achieve sustainability. A lot of interest in things like palm oil, sustainable soy, beef. There's a lot of attempts to try to improve the sustainability of supply chains. And some interesting green financial instruments. And of course, we're getting quite small here. You can see philanthropy and conservation NGOs, one would imagine, are quite a large source of funding, but in fact, compared to these other sources, quite low. And then finally, here's nature-based solutions and carbon markets, which, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of money in carbon right now, but using it for nature conservation is still quite low and something that we want to increase. So this is a quick overview of where the money comes from now. And this is what we have. So roughly $130 billion of financing a year goes to help nature exist. And you can see that's a 0.15% of global GDP, tiny percentage of global GDP, gross domestic product. And it's been estimated that we need probably $400 billion to $700 billion a year in financing for nature to achieve our goals, to keep nature functional and maintain the services that we depend on. So that's quite a large growth that we need to find some money for. And now I'm going to put this in perspective. So we have about 130 billion. We need maybe up to 700 billion a year. But in comparison, governments are actually spending 500 billion or more, because these are, I've seen some estimates of that go much higher than this in subsidies. And these are subsidies for fossil fuels, which of course harm nature through harming the climate. Subsidies for agriculture that are potentially harmful as well to nature. And then subsidies for fisheries, which result in overfishing and harm to the oceans. So here we need to put more money into nature, but in fact, governments are spending a lot of money on activities that are harming nature. And so there's been a big push now to try to reduce these harmful subsidies. And that would go a long way to, and if we could redirect some of that money that is being spent on subsidies towards nature, that would go a long way to cover that, what's called the financing gap there. But I don't think that's the main story here. This graph here is indicating the amount that we're spending on nature, which, if you remember from before, it was less than 1%. It was 0.15% compared to the global GDP here. So what is the rest of the money that we're spending annually in GDP? What is that doing? Is that all being spent, or is part of that being spent on sustainable activities? Not a whole lot. So a lot of the economic activity of the world is being spent on activities that are not benefiting nature and in fact may harm nature. So we have this tiny little sliver. So not only do we need to expand that sliver and close the quote financing gap, but we need to address the rest, which is financing, our everything else we do. And a study from the World Economic Forum recently estimated that about $44 trillion of global GDP, which is roughly half of the global GDP, is dependent on nature. I mentioned before pollinators, soil health, water flows, water regulation, all these things. They estimate that about half of GDP is at risk because it's dependent on nature. So we work on conservation finance. This is a term that we use. It could also talk about sustainable finance for nature. And I'm going to just share with you a definition that we came up with. We published last year. It says mechanisms and strategies that generate, manage, and deploy financial resources and align incentives to achieve nature conservation outcomes. So we're talking about a range of different things. So generating money, and there's a whole range of mechanisms we can use to generate money. Two of the important approaches are the user pays or the polluter pays principle. So if you have someone who's benefiting from nature, if you can get that user of the services or products of nature to pay, that helps generate money. And then polluter pays, someone that damages nature, if we can get them to pay as well. But also managing money. It's really important that, for example, in a lot of countries, money can be taken in by parks, but the government sends that money to Treasury. It's a form of a tax, basically, and then Treasury doesn't necessarily funnel that money back to the parks. So how we manage the money we generate is important as well, and then how we deploy it. How we choose the projects in which to finance, the activities that are targeted, who gets the money, all that kind of stuff. So we need to really think about that because we want to use the limited funds we have very efficiently. And then the last piece here is aligning incentives. And we put this on because of that graph I showed with the rest of the activities of humans. So if we don't improve the way all the different stakeholders behave and align their incentives and motivation, then we're going to end up, you can spend as much money as you can get, but you're still not going to stop the harm that humans are doing to nature. And so we're not going to reverse the harmful trends that we're experiencing. And another sort of theoretical thing, and then I'll get to some examples. So how do we solve some of these challenges here? One is we can try to decrease the cost of conservation. If we can reduce the threats that nature is experiencing, we don't have to spend as much money protecting it. For example, if you're in a protected area and you have people that are poaching, well, then you need more guards, you need more trucks, you need more fuel, and if you can eliminate the poaching, then of course you've decreased your costs. The other piece here is increasing capital. This is sort of generating that additional money. We need more money for nature. And on the bottom side here, we want to try to discourage those harmful actions, discourage people from using too much pesticides that's going to run off into the waterways, and harm fish and cause dead zones and things in the Gulf of Mexico and other places. But we also want to try to incentivize positive actions, encourage people to create conservation positive businesses, for example. So, on the top, you're talking about money. On the bottom, you're talking about behavior. Sort of on the left side, how do you decrease the negative or the harmful? And on the right, how do you increase the positive? And for all this, delivering better is key, because no matter what you do, there's efficient ways and effective ways of doing it. And if you're not doing that, you are missing an opportunity. So that's it for sort of the theory. In our paper we released last year, we kind of proposed a taxonomy of different finance mechanisms divided up into these 7 classes. I find it to be a useful way to kind of do a survey of all the mechanisms that exist out there. And I'm going to provide some examples here. So we're going to go through each one of these things in turn. And I'm going to be given some examples. But the 7 main classes here are return-based investments. So types of investments that generate a return for the investor, some sort of profit. The second is economic instruments. And these are tools that really are focused on aligning incentives, but they can also generate revenue from fees and are quite some of the more powerful mechanisms we have for nature conservation. Grants and other transfers. These are sort of more traditional tools where a philanthropy or organization will give a grant. Business and markets. These are sort of, in a way, voluntary. So they're not regulatory based, but more voluntary based activities by businesses and the creation of markets to facilitate financial flows and bring some of those externalities in. And the 5th is public financial management. If you recall from that, one of the first graphs I showed, the public budgets are the largest source of financing for nature. And why might that be? I mentioned before that nature is generally a public good. It's something that it's really hard to bring into the market. It's something that maintaining nature provides for the general well-being of the population, and this is the role of government. So it makes perfect sense that the largest source of financing for nature comes from governments, because there's really no other entity that's responsible for it, directly responsible. So, and then the last two are going to be interesting sort of risk management tools and financial efficiency. So let's start our survey here. With return-based investments, quite a range of different tools have been used for nature conservation. Microfinance, we're finding is really essential in a way, and it's been underused. There's a really great company called GreenFi that looks to use microfinance tools to help communities better manage their areas by tying their credit rating to activities that they do for supporting the management, like planting mangroves, for example. And they work with microfinance organizations and other partners, peer-to-peer investing, crowdfunding, angel investing, incubators, and venture capitals. There's a lot of interest in financing nature, a lot of new venture capital firms that are starting up, some incubators. We actually have our own at the Conservation Finance Alliance, but it's focused on conservation finance ideas, but there's a lot focused on social entrepreneurship, fewer focused on nature, but we're hoping to spur a lot of that going forward. There's some private equity firms that are starting to focus on this. Debt and loans and things like that actually is probably one of the more important sources of financing here, because a lot of natural resource-based companies like sustainable agriculture or sustainable fisheries provide returns that are more aligned to debt financing mechanisms versus, say, venture capital, which is looking for really high returns. And it's really hard to get those kind of high returns if you're not doing anything in just pure tech, really, in nature. So not a lot of nature tech, but there are some people working on it. Public capital markets, there's growth in green bonds, as everyone knows. These are mostly focused on renewable energy. There is growing interest in green bonds, or what I would call nature bonds, so bonds that are going to direct money towards nature. And there's a few blue bonds that have been issued, one from the Seychelles and a few others in development. So and then sustainable investment strategies, ESG investing and all those, can be much more targeted towards nature. So just some examples here of this, return-based investing mechanisms. One of the pioneers in this space was a company called Althelia. They are now part of a company called Mirova. And they have different funds that are focused on natural capital. The first was focused on climate. They have a fund now called the Sustainable Ocean Fund. And they're making market-adjusted debt and equity investments in companies that are seeking to provide a return on nature. And they do sustainable ag combined with conservation. They do a whole range of things, ecotourism, and they're trying to show that you can make money by having a positive impact on nature. Fortunately for us, we have a brand new report that's come out from the Coalition for Private Investment and Conservation. It's called Conservation Finance 2021. And they're really focused here, not on my definition of conservation finance, but more on the private financing piece, those return-based investments. And here are a couple conclusions that they've found here, that the types of investments that are going in. Here's public equity, private debt, and real assets. So you can see on the left here, this is what they're calling this graph here is without the outlier. So there's the light color here shows a very large public bank that is providing public debt and private debt. So there are these development banks like Inter-American Development Bank and things like that are actually involved in this space and can be moving quite a lot of money, but they're considering that an outlier. So this graph here is looking at what is being spent on nature and how it's being spent. So there's your debt, your private debts being one of the largest sources there, but there's quite a lot of private equity going in. This is sort of the size of the deals closed. So there's 70% of the deals the transactions that have occurred are small. They're under $1 million. So this shows how kind of challenging it is to find investments at scale in the nature space here. So only 1% here was between $50 and $1 million. So most of them are, large percentage of them are going to be 5 million and under. So quite small investments. And this shows the types of markets in which they're investing in. And so here, commodities, timber, agriculture, these is the majority, a little bit in ecotourism, some other environmental markets here. I mentioned biodiversity offsets, water markets are another area. So, and then carbon was 12% here. So quite an interesting mix, heavily focused on agriculture, but agriculture is one of the greatest threats to biodiversity and nature. So if we can get more sustainable agriculture in place and reduce the threats to nature, this will be incredibly beneficial and reduce those costs, as I mentioned before. The second area here is economic instruments. As I mentioned before, these are quite powerful tools that governments use almost entirely. They can put in place different taxes, often termed green taxes, that could be both inciting positive behavior, but generally they're associated with reducing pollution and reducing harm to nature. Fees and charges, these are park entrance fees, things like that. Boat licenses, tradable resource use permits are a really interesting area. There are fisheries quotas that can be tradable. Any kind of ability to trade creates efficiencies in marketplaces. So you could have, in the US, they're exploring tradable credits for nutrient reduction, things like that. Fines and penalties, this is where it gets really boring, but in fact, putting in place fines and penalties for actions that harm nature is really essential. And one of the big challenges we see in developing countries is that they have the laws in place, they have the regulations, the fines are at the right level, but there's just zero enforcement or very low enforcement. And these can be great, they can align incentives very well, but only if you enforce them. Compensation and offsets, these are, as I mentioned, biodiversity offsets or wetland banking. You probably heard of that. These are mechanisms where a developer can come in and have an impact. They try to minimize their impact. There's a thing called the mitigation hierarchy, where you try to mitigate and offset or mitigate and reduce the impacts. But if in the end there's some residual impacts on nature, some countries have the ability to allow the developer to pay for or physically create an offset that compensates for the damage. And there's some other mechanisms here, deposit refund schemes and environmentally motivated subsidies. So subsidies can be positive. I mentioned how harmful subsidies are a big problem, but you can actually have a positive subsidy for nature. And that, again, aligns incentives and gets people doing things that are beneficial. All right, moving on to grants and other transfers. This is, again, something you'd probably be more familiar with: official development assistance. I mentioned USAID, private and corporate philanthropy, corporations providing money to nonprofits, private philanthropies give a lot of money. Remittances from overseas can be used in a way. And then finally, conservation trust funds, also called environmental funds. The example I gave here with a picture is Bloomberg Philanthropies, that has a big project called Vibrant Oceans, and they are trying to support ocean health and coral reefs, and have quite an extensive program there. But I just want to talk a little bit about conservation trust funds. We released a 10-year review on conservation trust funds last year, and you can download that at the website. And conservation trust funds are basically like national level nature focused foundations, and they have a lot of them have endowments, and they're able to use the investment returns from their endowments, just like a foundation would in America, to pay for conservation activities. Some are focused on protected area finance, maintaining financing for protected areas. The ones that have grown quite large and been quite successful are starting to explore other mechanisms for conservation finance, even going as far as looking at how they could use their capital to do impact investing. But a lot of them are also involved in payment for ecosystem services mechanisms, and very similar to conservation trust funds are a thing called water funds. And water funds are built around payment for environmental services targeted at water. They're often built around hydroelectric plants that put in place these funds and partnerships to basically protect the watershed, because protecting the watershed above a hydro really has huge economic and financial value to the hydro by reducing sedimentation and reducing the cost of maintenance. So it's these kind of innovative partnerships and financial mechanisms that really need to bring together diverse players to solve the challenge of all these externalities and diverse interests. Fourth category here is business and markets, and here these are not compliance related business issues, but this is where a company might recognize that its supply chain is under threat. And I think a lot of people have heard there's a few leading companies in the water space. Coca-Cola, of course, recognized their reliance on watersheds some time ago when they had a real problem with local farmers. Lots of great stories about that. But there's a lot of work being done in cotton, in palm oil, and chocolate, and a lot of these supply chains. The companies realize that ecological management and sustainability is an essential part of keeping their supply healthy and keeping the prices from fluctuating wildly when you have problems in the supply chain. There's a range of conservation businesses focused on achieving conservation outcomes, corporate social responsibility and sustainability, where the difference there is that the company's business model is really tied to recognition of their dependence on nature or their impacts on nature. And then there's voluntary offsets. So these are, again, not compliance, is not government regulation, but voluntary offsets are generally around carbon and a thing called REDD Plus, or reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, could provide these carbon credits at very low cost and have all these amazing co-benefits. And it's really great to see. This little app here is Ant Financial has a project in the Philippines where they basically are using planting trees as incentive to get people on their platform, and you get eco credits, and after enough credits the company will plant a tree for you. So that's generated, I think, $500,000 already for the Philippines reforestation efforts. Public financial management, as I mentioned before, it's so essential, and part of what we encourage is trying to understand how the public fiscal planning, budgeting, and disbursement process works. Oftentimes, ministries of environment are not really good at garnering adequate budget. We've in the past worked a lot with the ministries of economy and finance who understand externalities because they're economists, and they, but their complaint is that the ministries of environment don't know how to do really good budgets, don't know how to tie results to them. So there's a huge, again, being the largest source of financing, this is really boring nuts and bolts stuff, but it's really critical to getting it right for nature conservation. There's other mechanisms like fiscal transfers, like national government transferring to state, that can incentivize states to include more protected areas, oftentimes called ecological fiscal transfer. Governments provide grants as well, like pictured here, the Conservation Innovation Grant from the Department of Agriculture. And then, of course, reforming those harmful subsidies is essential. And then earmarking revenues for nature or other important ways to have an impact. So getting down to the last three here, the last two, risk management. is an area that is really interesting here. Nature provides enormous risk abatement services. Coastal protection is about reducing risk, keeping diverse ecosystems, maintain diverse pollinators. There's a huge value that nature provides in reducing risk. It's very difficult to capture that value. Risk is hard to quantify, but there's a growing range of insurance products, and insurance companies are really starting to look into this. They realize that they need to understand it. And there's a product called Parametric risk insurance that's been implemented in the Yucatan, in Mexico, for reefs, where it releases rapid funding right away when there's a large storm event, and there are teams that go out there and rapidly repair the reef so that the damage is not permanent. There's a pay for success, a thing called pay for success, which is also called a social impact bond or an impact bond. And that's what this rhino bond is here. There's some conservationists have developed this in Africa that basically gets investors to upfront the money for conservation actions, in this case, rhino conservation. And if the goals of that action are successful, then a outcome buyer will come in and compensate the private sector for the money that they've put in, plus a return. And this is called pay for success. And I think the outcome buyer for the rhino bond is the Global Environment Facility. And the World Bank is leading that right now. And then there's blended finance. Blended finance, I'll talk to you a little bit about in a second, but it's a mechanism where the public sector can come in and provide grants, philanthropies can come in, you can have financial institutions that can provide concessional loans, encouraging the private sector to also come in. So you're blending grant, concessional finance, and private market-based finance, and by, in a way, moving the risk to the organization where it's most appropriate. And we've been working on with the UN and other partners on the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, which is a blended finance instrument to try to save coral reefs. And it's a multi-partner fund. We have different governments that are involved, different philanthropies. Paul Allen Family Foundation and Prince Albert II of Monaco led it off. And really interesting approach, focusing on trying to get private sector solutions financed by the private sector to come in and help maintain coral reefs, recognizing that governments are not putting enough money into it themselves. And this is one of the resources, one of the ecosystems that's most at threat with climate change. So the last category here is financial efficiency, management effectiveness, public-private partnerships. Integrated accounting refers to what is also called natural capital accounting. And this is a way to capture the value of nature and include it in the country's system of accounts, like the system of accounts that calculates gross domestic product and things like that. And the idea here is to try to not ignore nature in the accounts. So you're not just looking at GDP, but you're looking at the amount of natural capital that you're maintaining, because you can have great GDP if you cut down all your forests, but that's short term. But somehow if we can show the loss of the natural capital, that maybe the politicians and business can make better decisions. And then finally, last but not least, is mainstreaming biodiversity and development. And this is just trying to integrate nature into the decisions that are made in development, government policy, breaking down the silos of different ministries that don't work together. And this is an area that has enormous value. And the example here I'm showing is from African Parks, which is like a public-private partnership. They're a nonprofit that comes in and negotiates a contract with government to manage a park. They're focused in Africa, and they work on parks that have ecotourism potential. So then they build lodges, they charge revenue, and they're able to finance themselves, improve the quality of the park, and reduce the cost to the government of having to maintain and manage those parks. And Another company, there's a nonprofit here called Blue Finance, doing very much the same thing for marine protected areas, and very innovative, similar model, relying completely on public-private partnerships with nonprofits and the government to bring in impact investors to upfront the capital to put in place good management, and then paying those impact investors back over time with a return based on revenue generated within that marine protected area. So this doesn't work for all marine protected areas, but for a subset. And then just as I'm going to end with one slide here called nature-based solutions. Now, this is a term you may be hearing a lot now. Oftentimes it's talking about climate change. So nature-based solutions to climate change involve, protecting forests, forest restoration, things like that. But also it's used for infrastructure, green infrastructure. Mangroves are essential to protect coastlines. And a lot of assets are at risk along the world's coast due to rising seas and increasing storm damage. And one company that was in our incubator called Matrix is doing some amazing things, integrating gray infrastructure, like putting in place cement, specially designed cement structures that aggregate natural either oysters or other natural life that attach to them and strengthen the coastline. So just a shout out to innovation in that space. And on that, just real quickly, the Conservation Finance Alliance is where I lead, and our mission is to promote awareness, expertise, and innovation in conservation finance globally. It's been around since 2002. We have about 1,600 members, and you can find more information at cfalliance.org or the full conservationfinancealliance.org. And I want to thank you so much for listening. I hope it wasn't too technical, and I look forward to questions. So I'm going to end there.
So much, David. No, it was a fascinating presentation, and I'm amazed at how you gave us such a comprehensive overview, so dense in such a short period of time. I want to open it up for Q&A, and I can tell you there were a couple of questions just right at the beginning, really basic. People want a copy of your slides. So if you decide to make those available, we will post them on the Yale Alumni Academy website. You will also find a recording of this presentation on the Yale Alumni Academy website, probably sometime this week. As soon as we're done sort of processing it and getting it off of Zoom, we'll post it, and we will email everyone who's registered today to let you know that it's available. If you have questions, if you could put them in the Q&A box, that would be really helpful to help me make sure I'm keeping track of all the questions. I can tell you another one, David, that people asked is right at the beginning when you were showing the pie charts of where the financing comes from. A number of people wanted to know whether that you were talking about US alone or whether you were talking about all countries collectively globally.
Right. So those are figures for the global amount that's being spent on nature. Yeah.
Okay. So let me get to Kim also just wanted a little bit of clarification on that point. Can you define what you mean by nature in relation to when you say money being spent on nature?
Sure. Yeah, it's hard. So nature and biodiversity go across so many different industries. So it's really hard to pinpoint and have a very specific definition, but that work was built around a project called Biofin, Biodiversity Finance Initiative, and it was one I was involved with. So we basically defined it as activities that are known to have positive impact on nature. So it's focusing on protected areas. It would be, for agriculture, it would be focused on organic or sustainable agriculture. For forestry, things like that, it would not be all tree planting, but it would only be tree planting that was ecologically sensitive, so native species, things like that. It does not include just pure climate change, for example. although, activities that favor sustainable climate help nature. That's not included in these estimates. But it's hard to draw the line, but a lot of work has gone into trying to clarify that.
Okay. So I think that answers Jared's question as well. Jared kind of drilled down a little bit deeper on this point. Just quantifying, is there a definition to quantify nature separate from the economic value of the raw resources?
To quantify nature.
So when you were speaking about, this is a question I had as well, when you were speaking about encouraging countries in the financial efficiency model to quantify their preservation or conservation of nature as a marker, just like they would quantify GDP, we know that GDP could look at the economic value of the raw resources, for example, that a country has available to it, but that would maybe be different from the conservation of its nature, of its natural environment. So I don't know if you can say more on that.
Yes, this is a really important issue here. So GDP generally, and there are people that have worked on this for years, but it basically measures throughput. So it doesn't actually take into consideration the stocks of assets that you have. It's like for a company, it would be your profit and loss statement rather than your balance sheet, right? And so part of measuring the value of nature. So for example, when the Exxon Valdez, this is quite some time ago, when they had a big oil spill, it actually increased the GDP of the US, I think, by like 1 or 2 percentage points. So like you had this huge environmental disaster, but because we spent so much money trying to clean it up, GDP goes up. So the people looking at trying to measure natural capital do measure both the stocks, which is the sort of fixed assets, and the flows. And although we would, in a way, converting all those to economic or monetary terms, like the price, is something that decision makers do pay attention to. We recognize that that's not appropriate in all cases, and it's certainly not easy in most cases. And so a lot of these efforts to track nature in the different countries measures the actual water flow, for example, the flow of rivers, the stock of wood. So it doesn't necessarily convert them into the monetary terms, which makes a lot of sense, because people do anything that you can measure is easier to manage. If you can't measure it, it's hard to manage. So even just any kind of numbers help out.
Okay, I want to go from there to Stephanie's question. She says, climate change and environmental degradation are global problems. However, the most rich world countries, I'm assuming most countries of the wealthy part of the world, their efforts and associated financial commitments focus on limiting greenhouse gases and environmental conservation in their own countries. How can we convince rich nations to refocus their efforts on developing in poor nations where financial commitments can get the biggest benefit for their expenditures?
Right. Such a great question. Let me just start with climate change. And there's of course the Paris agreement, and there's an ongoing effort to try to come up with global approaches to climate change. It's just because it's global. If you emit a ton of carbon in the US, it affects China and vice versa. So to me it's a little disheartening that there isn't a sort of global standard that makes it easy for someone in the US to say, let's say, invest in a carbon project in the Amazon, for example, right? Because the co-benefits of investing in nature conservation there are great. Like the benefit for carbon, a ton of carbon equivalent is a ton of CO2 equivalent. It's the same. But the benefits you get from protecting forests, for example, could include water, include pollination, include huge range of other services that you don't get from just eliminating a ton of carbon industrially. So it's a shame, but there's a lot of voluntary expenditures now. But there's no international market for this kind of thing, and we really could use some more standardization and development in that space. I think there was another part to the question, Lauren, but I don't
Well,
know.
I'm going to actually jump in because I have a follow-up on that with a story that I found really fascinating about the country of Brazil. And that Brazil, several years back came forward and said, our Amazon provides X proportion of the world's oxygen and eliminates a certain amount of CO2 emissions, essentially. And yet it has a value to us in terms of deforestation, businesses that benefit from deforestation. So rest of the world, if you would like us to preserve the Amazon, we'd like you to pay up. And there was a story that recently ran about Norway being one of the biggest investors in that scheme that Brazil developed, and the current Brazilian government sort of not making good on it. And how will this play out on the global stage? So I think it's an example of the question. Here you have the country of Brazil asking foreign governments to invest and subsidize its maintaining the rainforest, because you guys, rest of the world, are the ones benefiting from us having this rainforest. So I just wonder if you can comment on that story and the complexities of that scheme that Brazil developed.
Yeah, no, thanks. It was such a great example, I mean, of how complex this can get, right? So, I was talking about sort of small scale investing, but, on the larger scale, countries are sort of, trying to negotiate these agreements and commitments, the nationally determined commitments, things like that. The way that the carbon markets work currently is that if a country's had high levels of deforestation and change, then there's more credits to be had for a country like that than if a country has managed their forest really well, has not allowed deforestation, and they're providing a great service to the world by not cutting their forests. But the current carbon markets basically say that there's no value in that.
Don't really reward them for that.
Right. So there's all kinds of inequalities among countries in terms of so not just Brazil saying they're giving up what's called the opportunity cost, right? They're giving up their right to cut the forest down. We're going to do that for the global climate benefits, but we want to be compensated. I think it's normal for them to ask for that, and they should be compensated. But how do you compensate the countries that have traditionally not cut their forests down? We should be compensating them as well. There's only a handful of countries that are the large emitters, and the Paris Agreement has led to the Green Climate Fund, or not the Paris Agreement, but the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has led to the Green Climate Fund. This is a mechanism that is supposed to compensate and provide money for the developing world for adaptation and mitigation. And it's a good mechanism. There's a lot of money in it, but we need more. We need more money, and we need more mechanisms, and we need more standards. And the challenge is enormous. And from my perspective, again, keeping those forests in place is some of the most efficient and effective ways of avoiding carbon emissions.
Okay, great. We've got lots of good questions on this topic. I want to just remind everyone, if you can please post your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat. That helps me to keep track and make sure I'm getting to all of them. But if you want to open something up for everyone in the group, everyone on the discussion today who might have a comment, please do feel free to put that in the chat. But a question that you would like David Myers to address, please put it in the Q&A box. With that being said, I'm going to go to a question that I thought was pretty good in the chat. Is there a movement in Congress to reduce and or eliminate subsidies for fossil fuels and other environmentally destructive but very powerful industries? It seems like that's a fundamental issue, says Hannah. And James followed up just saying, are there good articles or subsidies that identify, are studies that identify the harmful subsidies? And then I'm just going to piggyback one more on this, sorry, which is generally a number of people have asked, how do we get governments to, how do we apply pressure on governments to put this funding forward? What legislation should we be supporting? What politicians should we be supporting? You can't tell us what politicians to support, but I think you can help us just understand what is happening in Congress, and where should people go to learn more about how to get political on these issues?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't provide even that much. I can, because I work mostly in the international space. So, but I can say that, the idea of trying to reduce, redirect, or ultimately eliminate these harmful subsidies is high on the list of actions that are going to be part of the global biodiversity framework at the next biodiversity, the CBD COP, which is coming up. Everyone recognizes how important this is, but it's so hard to get progress on them because you have these vested interests that have received these subsidies for years. They count on them as part of their business. They lobby hard for them. It's like this classic game we do when we're training for economics, where you give someone a pen and then you enter into a trading game, and someone who actually has been given a pen, who owns the pen, thinks it's so much more valuable than the person that would be willing to buy the pen. Once you own something, I think it's called the endowment bias. And once you have something, it's really, really hard to give it up. And subsidies are that way. Very interesting challenge, but no one's really come up with great solutions. So we like to say greening the subsidies. In other words, like, let's not take it away, but let's redirect it. So for fossil fuels, which again, the fact that we're subsidizing fossil fuels blows my mind. I saw there was some chat about that. Absolutely insane to me in today's with concerns about climate. But let's redirect that towards green energy. In other words, so some of the same companies maybe get that money, but it's all for wind, solar, and other sources. Or R&D or something like that. So you kind of negotiate in a way to change how that money is used. Agricultural subsidies, for example, they're considered key for the social benefits of food production and things like that. So take them away from fertilizers and give them towards farmers who are willing to try more regenerative agricultural techniques or reduced water use or something like that. In other words, you can still give the farmers subsidies, but give them subsidies that have less of a harmful impact on others and on nature.
Isn't the challenge with doing something like that you take the subsidy away from fertilizer, and the fertilizer company and their lobbyists, for example, in the US example, wield their power to make sure that gets reversed. I mean, in some of the examples that you've given of these financial instruments, it seems like there's an actor who is funding the instrument in some way, who just has the benevolent agenda rather than the profit-seeking agenda. And it seems to me that when profit-seeking is rewarded by funding nature, that we'll see a fundamental shift. So, I wonder if you could speak to that. Is there a future where this becomes so profitable that companies are fighting each other to do the right thing by nature?
There are people that believe that that the private sector will solve this by the same, competing race to the top kind of thing. The most sustainable company will, get the greatest market share, things like that. But The problem is that if there's one company that cheats and destroys nature, but then can produce the same product for lower cost, unfortunately, humans like paying less for things. And so, so ultimately, you do need a combination of those innovative, forward-thinking companies and government regulation to set the level playing field. And without that government regulation, you'll always get cheaters, and you'll always get someone undermining, even if it's a sort of an agreed strategy, like the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, for example, says, all right, no more deforestation. If you deforest, you have to compensate whatever. But all it takes is one company that says, yeah, we don't really care, and they can do all the deforestation. So that they're selling to some buyers that are willing to buy deforestation soy. And so all the other companies are good. All it takes is one company to be bad, and you still get the same level of deforestation, right? So you need government to come in and ultimately set the level playing field and enforce those regulations. As much as I'd love to believe in the companies will be willing to do that.
Yeah, okay. And just inadvertently, I think you addressed Morris's question about palm oil farming in causing disappearance of big swaths of jungle in places like Borneo, and whether or not this is a big problem. And I think you hit on that. So just letting you know that was something people were interested in hearing about. I want to we have a little bit more time for questions, and we have a ton of questions here. I want to go to Virginia's question. Have you heard of natural asset companies to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 2022? And if so, can you share insights on how they plan to generate financial returns for investors?
There is, that's a great question. I think there's about to be a huge amount of innovation in this space, and we all need to be creative here and come up with new mechanisms. There's a really interesting company that is looking into this called the Intrinsic Value Exchange, and you can look them up online, Intrinsic Value Exchange, and they're hoping to sort of create companies that do hold these natural capital assets and then list them on the stock market. How that is going to play out and how much they're going to be valued at is something that I'm looking forward to seeing. And there could be, there's other forms of credits that people are coming up with that are quite innovative. The Nature Conservancy has been one of the sort of innovators in this space, and they have a group called NatureVest, and they're working on together with the rest of TNC, a thing called resiliency credits. And so climate, I think it's climate and resiliency. So they're looking at, selling carbon. There's a thing called blue carbon, which is marine-based carbon offsets. And they're looking to sort of package that together with coastal protection and sell those credits, as something, as a unique tool. So a new credit on the marketplace, basically. So there's a lot of innovation coming around. The economic value of nature, as I mentioned in the beginning, is so high. There's got to be ways we can bring this into the market, but it does require innovation. It's not something that markets are going to go, oh yeah, we ignored this. There's money here. That's not the way it works. If they're external, they're hard to bring in, but there's innovation going on there.
Okay, you mentioned blue carbon, and that was something that Michael raised a question about, and he wants to know, I'm just summarizing what was a pretty long question, but he says the rules seem to say that you can't sell credits for, say, a mangrove area that's not threatened by destruction. So this was something that you talked about earlier, those that are doing well with their conservation somehow then don't qualify for the offset markets. And he says this is a big problem. Many areas are not threatened, but they provide these valuable ecosystem services. And whether you wanted to comment any more on that.
No, just that I agree that this is a problem and something that I'd like to see some innovation and some solution for, because absolutely there's large areas of mangroves that are protected, they are threatened, but threatened in the future. So if you can prove that they are threatened in the future, then it works with the existing system. But otherwise, I think we need a new system. I agree. It's a problem.
And just in speaking about credits, this is something that we've even dealt with quite a bit at Yale, and Yale has a plan for being sort of carbon neutral by 2050, I think it is. And within our travel program and the Alumni Association, we've looked at how can we bring ourselves into a state of being carbon neutral. We're promoting alumni to travel around the world to really interesting places. And we've had some real sort of provocative questions come in from alumni who are saying carbon offset credits don't work. It's an incredibly corrupt arena. It doesn't actually match up with the damage that's being done by, say, the professional business travel of all the affiliates of Yale University in a year. So there are a few questions that have come in about that. But I wonder if you could just comment on the idea of carbon offsets, how you evaluate whether or not they work, whether there's real strong integrity in the market for them.
Yeah, no, really great issues, and there's no simple answer. People are concerned that by allowing offsets in general, you're allowing industries to continue to pollute, and that doesn't make much sense. So really, my answer is that we need all the tools and all the solutions that we can get right now. We're in a race for to control and manage carbon and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Any way you can funnel some money into reducing emissions and help make people happy and make it last, I think that's good. But no, again, I'm a strong proponent of government action. I think that the only way we're going to manage these public goods and externalities is with very strong government regulation, and there's no substitute for that. There's no substitute for curbing emission levels. These cap and trade programs have worked for sulfur and nitrogen dioxide, and no reason that we can't use those kind of innovative market mechanisms for carbon. There are people that are, again, resistant to that, but it just creates efficiencies. And so offsets in a way create efficiencies too, but there's no alternative for government regulation to come in and try to clamp down or cap at least the emissions and start to try to reduce that. But in the meantime, if we can direct some money towards nature, I mean, if you look, 30 years ago, we were still pumping out terrible greenhouse gases, but no one was talking about offsets so it's not like when we created offsets, we allowed people to produce more. That's just how our economy is running. It's based on fossil fuels. And so we need to change that, and we need the drivers to change that. But anything that could funnel money to keeping forests in place is money well spent from an economic point of view.
Okay, great. Well, we have so many questions that we didn't get to answer, but I want to wrap up now and be respectful of your time. And before we go, I want to ask how people can follow you and your work and the new information that you're putting out through the Conservation Finance Alliance.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's easy to go to our website, and I'll type it into the chat in a bit, along with my email. I'm very happy for people to reach out to me. And you can sign up for our newsletter. We put it out roughly once a month, and you can follow what we're doing with that. If this is your field and you're interested in the space, become a member. It's free, and you get the newsletter, and then you get to be part of working groups as well. And really, appreciate all these great questions and all this interest. I feel like there's a lot of growing interest in this field, a growing interest in trying to really maintain nature that really hasn't been there. We sort of we keep taking it for granted, but now I think more and more people and companies and countries are realizing that it's at the point now where we really can't take it for granted anymore. We have to make conscious efforts to do something about it. So,
well, certainly, if we've learned anything from the past 18 months, it's that we do not live separately from the global environment. And no matter where it is on the world, in the world, whatever happens somewhere else can affect us. So thank you so much for the presentation. Lots of thank yous coming in through the chat. Are there any closing words that you would like to share?
Well, I guess my perspective is that first off, there's no one solution. There's no silver bullet for any of this. And I think if there's one thing that the presentation hopefully shared is that there's such a diversity of approaches, and we need all those different approaches all working together. We need people talking with each other, from agriculture and the water departments and companies talking with the private sector, companies talking with public sector and governments. So we need a lot more communication. Because we're in this together, and we need to solve these challenges together. One sector is not going to do it on its own. The private sector can't solve this. The public sector can't solve it on its own. And philanthropies and NGOs can't solve it on their own. We all have to work together. And thanks so much for having me, Lauren, and really appreciate everyone. Great questions and great interest.
Well, I'll use this wrap up as an opportunity to invite you, David, as well as everyone here in our audience, to our climate change conversation series, which is further along this topic and taking place this October and November. So keep an eye out on our email list. We would love to have all of you back to continue these conversations across a variety of themes. I think we've got at least 6 speakers lined up for you over a 3-week period. And David, you're sort of our early kickoff to announce our climate change conversation. So it's been a delight to be here with you this afternoon. I hope one day we'll get to go to Madagascar together.
Well, that would be excellent.
Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next Yale Alumni Academy presentation. Bye-bye.